Okay, maybe you could have a seat. I can't find Mike, but I think we'll go ahead and start. Ron, if that's okay? We got a couple of announcements first, and so...
Just give me one moment. This is Mike, where I'm just checking one thing on the front program.
1001. I'll make a couple of announcements while Mike is fixing all of that. Glad to see that Karen Bud Fallon is able to join us this morning, so that's why we want to get started pretty quickly so we can get all of our speakers in. I think we have an amazing lineup. So while they're finishing up, if you don't mind, you know what, I'd love it if we could start with Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, if you wouldn't mind standing. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
I need you to clean that recording if you want to look right, okay?
So now I have to make it again, sorry?
I want the gentleman to walk on stage, walk in here, and cue them to start before we start, like that, fresh.
So he comes back in?
Yes.
Okay.
One second.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to the 26th Annual American Agr-Women Symposium. This year we're presenting to you federal land policies, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So welcome, we're glad you're here, and we're going to start our panel discussion. We have a welcome here this morning, and so Kathy Revis, would you like to come and introduce our welcome speaker from the Department of Interior?
Thank you. Thank you, Karen. I am so pleased to introduce the welcomer from the Department of Interior. She's a Texan and former Ag Commissioner and also former Texas Comptroller. So but now her new title is Assistant Secretary for Policy Management and Budget at the U.S. Department of Interior. Susan was nominated for this position on July 10th, 2017, and she finally was confirmed as of June 5th, 2019. She waited 695 days for the Senate to confirm her position. Go figure. Anyway, she will be playing an important role in policy development, management reforms to align efforts among the bureaus, and stewardships of Department of Interior's fiscal resources. She serves as their Chief Financial Officer, Chief Acquisition Officer, and Chief Performance Officer. In Texas, she served 16 years as a statewide elected official. She served as the state's first female Ag Commissioner, and then as the Texas Comptroller of Public Accounts. She is married. She has 3 sons. They now have kids. She tells me she keeps her slim and trim figure by walking all over Washington. It is such a great honor and pleasure to introduce Susan Combs. Didn't get everything in
Hey,
there.
Myron. Well, good morning and welcome to the Department of the Interior. I'm so happy to see my friend Mr. Ebell, who will be a treat, and he'll be followed by a great panel of fabulous people here. But I just want to say welcome to the Department of the Interior. I used to come up here when I was Ag Commissioner, et cetera, and so it's sort of interesting being on the inside. This is a beautiful building, and if you'll take a look around, you will see murals, you'll see carvings in stone, but it's a lovely place, and I want to say that all of us who are here are working very hard to represent the interests of the American public. And as a rancher out in the Big Bend of Texas, where we've been out since 1882, we're very attuned to land issues, regulatory issues, water, et cetera, and so I think you're in for quite a treat today. I'm still a member of the West of the Pecos Cattle Women, and I pay my dues regularly, or I get a dunning email. But again, back to the Department of the Interior, we're so glad to have you here and host you in this wonderful Yates auditorium, which was sort of refurbed a while back. But the department is a huge land manager, as I'm sure you're aware. About 20% of all of the land in the United States is held by the Department of the Interior, whether it's through the Bureau of Land Management or the National Park Service. So we have a lot of regulatory agencies where we welcome your input because, in fact, it's so important that we understand what your perspectives are on all this. And water issues are obviously critically important to all of us, whether you're in the East and the West. And this department is what they used to call the Department of Everything. They've sort of pushed a bunch of things in it over the years. And my job, in my present job, is to do the reorganization for the department. When I got here in January of 2018, there were about 8 bureaus with 49 separate overlapping spaghetti-like regions, and we were able to move that to 12 regions, and those took effect on August the 22nd of 2018, and it is my job to go ahead and take a look at how we buy. We acquire things in a seamless, coordinated fashion so we're not siloed. I'm taking a look at all of our IT purchasing. We spend well over $1 billion a year of your money, and we would like to spend smart. And we're taking a look also at external-facing things such as recreation, conservation, and permitting to be sure that we are paying attention to what is going on across the country. And again, I will state, we do need your input and your feedback. With respect to reorganization, we hope, and the Secretary Bernhardt is very clear on this, that we will like to move decision-making to the field where the constituents are, where you are, and so that you don't have to get on an airplane or call somebody and come to D.C. to get an answer to a question. So whether it is a permit or whether it is a rule or regulation, we want to have folks in the field near where you are to be able to respond to you, which we think also will improve accountability. So all that said, I'm mindful of the clock, and Myron's going to be, I think, giving you a great background. But I just want to say welcome to the Department of the Interior, and we're so glad that you're here. And I hope that when you're in this great city, which is our nation's capital and your capital, that you will take a look, wander around. The mall is right out the front door, that way. Front door, and take a look, because this is your capital and your building. So thank you so much for letting me come and visit. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker. I'm Mitzi Perdue. I was the president of AAW from, 68, I'm getting the dates mixed up. Anyway, in 88, I was president. And I believe in an introduction that it ought to go both ways. So, Myron, let me introduce you to the people you'll be addressing. There are 66 of us here. There were almost 100 who wanted to come, but we had to cut it off at 66. That's how interested people are in the topic. The people that you'll see here, most of them are here because they're absolute leaders of their state. They're people who've just made it to the top because of competence and conviction and ability to spread ideas. There are also some younger ones here. Are any of the guys still here? Wave your hands if you're a guy. Hey, we're really proud and happy that you're here too. Well, that's who you'll be addressing. Now, everybody else, let me tell you about Myron. And first of all, why he's here. He's here by a confluence of coincidences, but I belong to something called the Competitive Enterprise Institute. For years, I've been reading absolutely brilliant things on topics that deeply interest me. About maybe half a year ago, the American Agr-Women President's Council was discussing who we would have as speakers. Well, our topic is the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I thought for the good part, we would have Myron Ebell. And let me just read you a couple of things about his background. He's worked on energy and environment issues for more than 2 decades, spending more than 15 years at the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Yay, CEI, everybody. I love it. He researches and advocates for sensible energy policies that benefit everyone. Instead of policies that simply react to alarmism, Ebell advocates for climate policies that reflect the scientifically supported view that affordable, plentiful, and reliable energy make the world safer, the environment more livable, and should be accessible to those who need it most. Please join me in welcoming our great speaker, Myron Ebell.
So, good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm not sure I've ever said that about being in the Interior Department building before, but it's really you, not the Department of the Interior. In fact, I never thought I would give a talk in the Department of the Interior. So it's a great pleasure, and I'm honored that you invited me to speak to you today. I have worked over the years, but particularly in the 1990s when the land use wars and the property rights wars were at their peak. I've worked with several of your state associations, and I don't want to make invidious comparisons, but comparing your group, your constituent groups, to the the Farm Bureau and the Cattlemen's Association, I just want to say that your groups were always the most effective, the most committed, and I always thought got the most done. So it's a great honor for me to be here, and I want to thank Mitzi Perdue and the past presidents for inviting me. Now, let me, can I start here? Oh, there I am. Okay. Well, I just want to say, I just want to present my bona fides. I was born and raised as an Agro-American, and I'm one by conviction, although for my sins I've had to live most of my adult life in Washington, D.C. This is Baker Valley in eastern Oregon. Those are the Wallowa Mountains in the background. Baker Valley was a historic gold mining region all in the mountains all around, but my family, my great-grandfather emigrated from Germany in the 1860s. My father was a farmer who gave up on farming and became a full-time rancher when he discovered in the 1950s that horses just weren't economic anymore and he had to have tractors. My mother grew up on a farm in Nebraska. My paternal grandmother grew up on a farm in Minnesota. And so I'm kind of the black sheep in the family, not being from, let me go back here. Oops. Oh, there's some cattle. This is also in Baker Valley looking the other direction at the Elkhorn Mountains, which are right on the edge of the valley. So, now, what is CEI? CEI is a small organization. It's a free market, nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy institute that specializes in regulatory issues. I do energy, climate, and environment, but we do virtually every kind of regulation. I'm not going to read all this, but we are skeptical of government and its tendency to grow and to take over people's lives and to control people's lives. Now, I'm going to talk, I have sort of two parts to my talk today. I should have three, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I don't have a lot of good to say about the federal estate, but I know that many of you are from the West and you know all about this, and many of you are not from the West and maybe you've only heard about it. So I want to talk about the federal lands in the West, and then I want to talk about the federal regulations on private land, which are of interest, I think, to the entire agricultural community. When we talk about the federal lands in agriculture, we're mostly talking about grazing, livestock grazing. And if you look at it, it's a very small part of agriculture. It's even a very small part of agriculture in most of the western states. But these are the people who are on the front lines, and they have experiences that I think everyone should know about. And I think you've got some members here who know more than I do because you live it every day. I should say my father had a grazing permit, which he sold in the 1960s because he said the Forest Service and the BLM were getting too hard to deal with. That was in the 1960s. Now, the much larger operation that bought his grazing permit, of course, went out of business a long time ago. So the federal estate is really huge. Here's a map that shows what it is. I think many of you have seen this. How much of each state it is. We peak with states like Nevada and Alaska. And by the way, Alaska looks really small, but remember, Alaska, Susan Combs is left. Remember, Alaska is twice as big as Texas. So even my state, Oregon, is 53% federally owned. So here's the breakdown. Now, I'm not going to have a lot to say about the Fish and Wildlife Service today except for the Endangered Species Act, and I'm not going to have a lot to say about the National Park Service. But I would say this about the National Park Service. Stay away from them. Look, there are good park superintendents, and there are parks where the National Park Service are good neighbors, but the superintendents come and go, and many of them turn out not to be good neighbors. They want your land, and if they can't buy your land and force you out, they often want to control it. And so we have in the parks, we have a perpetual urge to assert not regulatory authority, but to get into the local land use zoning processes and try to push things that the Park Service thinks are good for the parks. One of these is the concept of view sheds. That is, you can't do something over there because it will impact our visitors' view. In some parks, in one park in particular, the park superintendent tried to impose through the local county zoning a smell shed, so that livestock growing was smelly and was diminishing the experience of people visiting the Civil War battlefield. So let me move on here. Okay, the problem with the federal lands is that they comprise 27% of the country, but that's not enough. In 1965, the first preservation bill came into effect, the Wilderness Act, and the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is about acquiring more private land and turning it into federal land. So it supposedly it's supposedly a trust fund that takes money from offshore oil royalties and spends it on buying land. There are some other purposes too, but by and large it's about buying land. So there's been more than 5 million acres acquired since 1965 by the federal government and over 2.5 by state governments. So this process doesn't end in terms of turning private productive land into unproductive government land. Now, I think you all know this who have experience with the federal government. The federal government is not a good steward. It's not a good environmental steward of the land. Now, okay, it's not all this. It's like this. Some places are much they're much better stewardship than others. Some agencies are better. Some districts, some forests, and so on. But the fact is that there are two reasons why government ownership of the land can never be as good environmentally, let alone economically, as private land. The first is that the federal land managers don't have the same incentives. They don't have the right incentives to take care of the land. If you're a private landowner, you lose the value of your land if you don't take care of it. And therefore, you have a tremendous incentive to be a good steward. Now, we know that some people at some times face problems, and they overgraze their land, or they do a poor job farming. We know that not all private farmers are great stewards, but on average, they're much better than federal land managers. It's not necessarily because they're better people. They have the right incentive. Federal land managers have a constant incentive to fail. That is, they don't lose the value. They don't lose their investment if the land is degraded. And in fact, we see this with the fire regimes in the West now. The more forests you burn down, the bigger budgets you get to fight forest fires. From a huge incentive throughout government that when you fail, you can then come back and ask for more money from Congress and take it out of the federal treasury. We see this in education. The more education fails, the more money we're asked to put into it. The same is true of the federal lands. The other problem with federal land management is it's subject to political capture. And there was a time perhaps in the West when the people who had captured the federal lands, particularly the BLM lands, were probably the graziers, the cattle and sheep people. But those days are long gone. Now what we have is the environmental movement has captured federal land management going back to the 1960s and 70s, and it's gotten more and more toxic during that period in terms of the interests and well-being of rural Americans and the rural environment. And so I call it urban eco-imperialism. Urban eco-imperialism comes from, it stems from the elites, the very wealthy and well-connected people in our urban centers who think they know more about how to run your lives than you do. And they know more about how to protect the environment than you do. And they know more about what's good for your land than you do. These are the people who set the agenda in Congress and increasingly in the agencies for federal lands policies. And this is pretty ugly. And I think any of you who have had experience with the BLM or the Forest Service know how ugly it can get. So I've listed some premises of urban eco-imperialism. There are some more, but I would say the most important is this hostility to private property. That somehow if the government owns the land, it's going to be in better shape than having private owners who are trying to use the land and produce whether it's timber or agricultural products on it. So the other thing I would say is that these people, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the sponsor of the Green New Deal, is a good example. She's, as far as I know, she's a well-intentioned person, but she has no idea where stuff comes from. If you listen to her and you read the Green New Deal, you'll see that they have no idea how much stuff you have to dig up to build a few 100,000 windmills and a few million solar panels. They have no idea where food comes from, and you can see that in when she was talking about the community garden in the Bronx. So there is a huge amount of ignorance and naivete amongst the people who promote urban eco-imperialism, and yet they still believe that they know better. Now, the problem with this is that the federal lands there are so many of them in the West, and they comprise so much of the total land area, that the federal land agencies really control the economies of many local areas. And since the 1960s, with the passage of the Wilderness Act, we have had more and more withdrawals from multiple use, from productive use, that is, grazing, mining, and timber, and recreation. Recreational access is also is under threat constantly in many of our federal lands. So the whole idea now of the federal lands is that they should not be there to produce anything. They should be there as nature museums. And that's what we have. We have nature museums and we have declining communities. I know all of rural America, I mean, the problem with you farmers is you're way too productive, and so that we need fewer and fewer farmers and rural people to produce more and more food. And so consequently, the political balance continues to go against rural America and in favor of urban America, which could be okay if urban Americans were appreciative and understood that, in fact, you know better how to run your lives and how to manage the land than they do. So I want to talk about why this seems to be so overwhelming. It's because the money, it's not only the population, it's the money is on the side of urban eco-imperialism. I've listed a number of groups here. I've listed 3 of the land trusts: the Nature Conservancy, the Conservation Fund, and the Trust for Public Land. In my view, those are 3 of the more sinister organizations in the country. But we also have all these environmental groups, and you add up the top 50 environmental groups. I've got about 15 there, maybe. You add up the top 50, and they have an annual budget of $3 billion, more than $3 billion. So it's a huge movement that is really dedicated to, well, let me just say, by and large, they're against you. Now, I'm now going to switch from federal lands to federal land and water regulation. And when I say land, we talked about this as federal land policy. Of course, a lot of it is water, and I'm glad Brenda Berman is from the Bureau of Reclamation is here to talk about some water issues. But what the federal government doesn't own, there are many people in Congress and in the federal land agencies supported by the environmental pressure groups who want to control the land that they don't own. And I think many of you have direct experience of every one of these things I've listed. The Endangered Species Act, the Migratory Bird Act, the Clean Water Act, wetlands permitting, NEPA, coastal zone management, the trail system, the Wild and Scenic River System, the Historic Preservation Act, and I would add to this permanent conservation easements, but I'm not going to talk about them. What I would say is, I'm going to just say something about the bottom three there, the Wild and Scenic Rivers, trails, and historic preservation. I don't know if any of you live near a trail or a wild and scenic river, but if you ever hear about one for your area, be sure to oppose it before it gets going. Because a corridor, a long corridor like a trail, then gives the Park Service tremendous ability to come in to the local zoning process and try to control the land all along the corridor. It's even worse with rivers because, of course, rivers flow and, well, I think you know all the problems with the, I read your white paper on the wetlands rule, the repeal of the WOTUS rule, and I'm right there with you on that. They did a good job repealing it, and now they need to do a better job replacing it. So here's a map of the National Trails system. It's, well, what can I say? Now, the Endangered Species Act has been around since the early 1970s. There have been many, I've been working on and off to try to reform or replace the Endangered Species Act since about 1990. So far, this is how much I have to show for my efforts, and a lot of other people's efforts have similarly been fruitless. Our best chance to reform it was in 1995 and 96 when the Republicans took over the Congress. There was clearly majority support in the House to pass a good reform bill. It was stopped, you may be surprised to know, by the Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, who was a member of the Sierra Club long before he was a Republican. And if you would like to know more about that, I can refer you to scholarly articles that discuss how he stopped the reform of the Endangered Species Act. Now, the good news is, and I would like to say something good about the Department of the Interior. You know, I've dealt with a number of administrations, and it's great. The team that President Trump has put together at the Department of the Interior, it's great to see people who actually like people like you and me. They actually don't see us as problems who need to be managed. Well, there may be a couple of you that they need to manage, but and probably I need to be managed. But this is very unusual. This is not true of the way things were in the George W. Bush administration, where they saw people like you as people who needed to be managed and kept in a box, essentially. So it's great. The team that Secretary Bernhardt, all the way down, it's just a great team. And they are there to try to improve things. And one of the things they're trying to improve is the rules, not the legislation. Congress ultimately will have to fix the Endangered Species Act, but they are doing what they can to reform the rules under Sections 4 and 7, and I think the final rule is going to come out this month. And you need to get behind it. You need to support it. So here are a few endangered species. I put these on here just sort of randomly because I want you to all remember it's not just big mammals that everybody likes or beautiful birds. There's the northern spotted owl that really started the downward spiral. There's a mussel. There's a bug, a beetle, and a plant, a type of vetch from Virginia or North Carolina or somewhere. So let me give you a few examples on what's being done by the Trump administration, by the team here at Interior and the Forest Service over at USDA to improve federal land management, to take the rural people's interests who are affected by these policies seriously, and to to also lift the regulatory burden from some of these rules. So I mentioned the ESA rules. The WOTUS rule, I think you're all familiar with. The WOTUS rule was, look, the problem with repealing the WOTUS rule that's not enough. The wetlands program was totally out of control before the WOTUS rule, right? So the key with the replacement rule is it has to go well beyond just getting rid of the WOTUS rule. So far, I don't think it does that, and I think it's going to need some improvement between the proposed rule and the final rule, so I'm glad to see your white paper because I think you hit all the right notes. I want to mention the pardons of Dwight and Steve Hammond that the President gave last year. Are many of you familiar with this story? This is out in the Oregon desert near it's BLM land, but it's near the Fish and Wildlife Refuge there, the National Wildlife Refuge there in the Malheur. This is a really important thing. There's no way to ever make things right, but at least you can end the injustice that was done to Dwight and Steve Hammond and their whole family. As one state legislator emailed to me last week after a court blocked the Interior Department has restored the Hammonds' grazing rights, their grazing permits. And a judge blocked that last week, and a state legislator, emailed me and said the only crime the Hammonds ever committed was that they refused to buckle under from decades of persecution by the Fish and Wildlife Service and the BLM who want their land. They want to drive all the ranchers out so that the wildlife refuge can expand. And let me just say one thing about wildlife refuges. There is a huge problem with wildlife refuges. Some are designated by Congress and they have boundaries. That's okay. We can fight those. If there's a bill to create a new wildlife refuge, we can fight it, or maybe support it. Who knows? That won't be me, but maybe some of you will support it. But the other thing is the Fish and Wildlife Service has its own sources of revenue from things like duck stamps. They use that money to create new wildlife refuges which have not been authorized by Congress, and they don't have boundaries. This is a huge problem, and it's one, I don't think we're going to see that under the Trump administration, but it's something that future administrations and certainly past administrations have done. We've had, I think, inadequate rollbacks of the national monument designations. I think the Zinke review was defective. He did not follow the President Trump's executive order. He tried to do as little as he could in terms of rolling back some of these national monument designations. So I'm hopeful that Secretary Bernhardt, perhaps in a second Trump term, will get around to actually following the executive order. Of course, they're getting back to oil and gas leasing. The coal leasing moratorium has been lifted. They're trying over at the Forest Service to increase timber sales, which I think some of you know went down to virtually nothing. The annual harvest was, in, say, 1990, it was like 14 billion board feet. In recent years, it's been under 2 billion board feet, which is why our national forests are burning up every summer. I have personal experience about that, which I can tell you. Our ranch was burned out. Our summer range, or summer grazing range, and I have a photo, was burned out from a BLM fire in 2015. And another thing is that President Trump said he would get us out of the Paris Climate Treaty. In terms of our well-being, particularly in rural America, people who dig up stuff, make stuff, and grow stuff for a living, this is incredibly important. So I just want to show you this photo. That was June 1st, 2017. You'll notice me on the right in the second row. So what is to be done? Here's a start. There is now legislation in Congress to make the Land and Water Conservation Fund not subject to congressional appropriation. That is to say, right now, it's not really a trust fund, it's a sort of phony trust fund. Every year, the Congress decides how much money to spend on land acquisition. And usually it's about $200, $300 million. That's way too much, but it's really popular with the urban elite. And there's a huge amount of support for it from a wide variety of groups, including sportsmen's groups, Ducks Unlimited, and so on. This bill would make it an automatic appropriation. That is, $900 million would go into buying land every year without Congress deciding how much money to spend. And that would be forever, because the Land and Water Conservation Fund, earlier this year, a bill was passed with significant Republican support to make the Land and Water Conservation Fund permanent. So if they get this second bill through to make it an automatic appropriation, there will be land being transferred from private ownership into federal ownership and state ownership forever. Support the final ESA rules, work to improve the WOTUS replacement rule. And now I have several suggestions starting here and going on to the next page, which I'll need to explain a little bit. I think the way to get reform of our land use laws like wetlands and endangered species are to pass regulatory takings compensation. This is the House passed this legislation in 1995 and 96, but there was never a vote in the Senate. The idea is if a regulation takes the value of your property, the government should pay for it. That is, if it's a public interest, the public should pay for it. The costs of providing habitat for an endangered species should not be borne by the private landowner. I think regulatory takings compensation has tremendous appeal with people who don't understand anything else about it. It even passed in Oregon twice by statewide initiative, and Oregon is a very green state that's very urban dominated by Portland and Eugene. So I think this is something that everybody on our side should get behind and get Congress to start working again on regulatory takings compensation. I think we need to get back to multiple use on the federal lands. Oops, my slide here. Well, okay, I've left out a slide. I have a couple other things here. Let me make sure I know what they are. Yes. The ultimate solution for the federal lands, and I had a slide, but I think many of you are familiar with the work of Ken Ivory, a state legislator in Utah, and the American Lands Council. It's now headed by a state senator in Montana, Jennifer Fielder. The American Lands Council and the state of Utah have put together legislation. It's actually passed in Utah to transfer the federal lands to the state. Not all the federal lands, not the national parks, but to transfer those lands so that the state could manage them better, the state could manage them more cheaply, better environmental values, and they could also make those lands much more productive. In Utah, the state lands are one of the major, the revenue from the state lands is one of the major sources of school funding. And remember, going back to that map, close to 60% of Utah is federally owned. So I think the real solution to the federal lands is eventually to either transfer them to the states or, and I know Ken Ivory and Jennifer Fielder won't like to hear me say this, or privatize them, put them into private ownership. So those are the things that I would recommend to you as things that we all ought to get together and work on. This is our summer range up in the edge of the mountains. It's sort of brown. It's in August. All of that timber there's a lot more timber on either side of this little bare patch. All of that was burned down by a forest fire on BLM and Forest Service land that the BLM, that the ranchers involved got under control overnight after a lightning strike in late afternoon. They worked all night. They had it under control. The BLM hotshots showed up the next morning. They told the ranchers they had to leave, and they then watched the fire go out of control and eventually burn 107,000 acres because of the huge fuel buildup of timber that hasn't been cut on BLM and Forest Service land. That fire burned out 95% of our range, all of our 27 miles of fences. The good news is it burned all that sagebrush you see, but it also burned up 600 acres of our commercial timber. So that's what the BLM and the Forest Service are on about these days. So here's a summary of CEI's views of the environment. Something's just not right. Our air is clean, our water is pure, we all get plenty of exercise. Everything we eat is organic and free range, and yet nobody lives past 30. That's the difference between what we're being told is good for the environment and our lives and what the reality is, and we all know why this is funny. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much for having me. Sure.
Maybe we'll have time for, we're running kind of short of time to get everybody in, but does anybody have maybe one question for Mr. Ebell, or are we happy with where the presentation's at? Okay.
Well, let me just say, it was good to see Linda Swarczynski here, whom I've known for many years, and we worked on some things back in the past. And I look forward to working with all of you. I have some business cards. If you're interested, I'll leave them with Mitzi. And I'm sorry I'm going to miss the panel with Andrea and Harriet and who's the third one?
I have a question.
Oh, yes.
What is happening? You mentioned the support is not working. It is not.
No, it is.
Oh, okay, thank you. What is happening, on the support, on the return of BLM and National Forest land to active management and resource protection? Is there anything, some type of bill, something we can get behind?
Well, you know, the problem is that if you look at the withdrawals of BLM and Forest Service land for multiple use, there's just a bewildering array of ways this has been done. Some have been done by Congress. If you create a wilderness area, that's an act of Congress. But we have areas of critical environmental concern, which are administrative withdrawals. We have huge amounts of the public lands have been withdrawn from mineral access. And this reminds me, one point I really want to emphasize is one of the problems that you face on the federal lands is that we used to have 3 groups of users and kind of part of another one that were all on the same side. Grazing permittees, loggers, and miners. And to some extent, the recreationists who want access, who oppose road closures and that kind of thing. The problem is the timber industry has been completely destroyed in the national forest, and the mining law has been gutted by actions spearheaded back in the 90s by Senator Harry Reid. And so the hard rock mining industry on federal land is really minimal. And the grazing permittees are under constant assault in some areas. There are many allotments that are now vacant in some states. And so how to restore productive use of these lands is going to require a piecemeal effort. I think the next panel that you have a couple of people on it who can talk about that, and I hope they will, because I think that the current Trump administration is very sympathetic to restoring multiple use to federal lands, but there are a lot of hurdles and there's a lot of opposition. So I think you need to work with them, and you need to tell them that this is a priority, because there's the rural West, a lot of it is just shriveling up and dying as a result of closing the land, closing access. And even recreational access is being closed off in many places. They're closing thousands of miles of roads in some places. Now, I did want to say, I'm sorry I'm not actually going to be here for the next panel, although I'd like to be because it looks very interesting. I guess I'll have to watch it on video because I have to go catch a plane to fly to Roswell, New Mexico, which only has 3 flights a day from Dallas. And then I'm driving late this afternoon to go talk to the New Mexico Cattle Growers Association tomorrow morning in Ruidoso, which is up in the mountains about 80 miles west of Roswell. So I'm very sorry that I'm not going to be here for the rest of your program. And if there are no more questions, I will say I gave Mitzi some cards, and I gave her those things as well, right?
Yes, and
Oh, good.
Yes, thank you. You referenced that there might be some congressional movement toward reform within ESA Section 4 as far as listing determining endangered and threatened species, and Section 7 regarding how agencies would handle interaction if a listing were considered or that kind of thing, or action taken. Are there bipartisan sponsors on this? If not, if so, is there a bill number? Kind of how can we pursue it and follow it and turn it into something meaningful? Because I really thought this would have been pursued between 2016 and 18, and not right now.
Mm-hmm. Right. No, well, there isn't any, no, look, every effort to change a comma in the Endangered Species Act has failed, right? And if you propose changing one comma, the environmental groups will be out with a huge campaign the next day saying that you want to gut the Endangered Species Act. No, but the Department of the Interior, working with NIMFS, has proposed rules changes to the implementing rules, not to the legislative language. And those proposed rule came out last August, was it, Andrea? Yeah, CEI commented on them, and I think some of your groups commented on those changes. And the final rule is supposed to be coming out this month, and I bet Andrea can tell you all about it. And David Bernhardt assured me when I ran into him in the hall the other day that I'm going to love the final rule because it's even better than the proposed rule. So one of the things you all should be prepared for is to come out with support and enthusiasm about this final rule, because this is the first progress we've made in a long time. I remember back in the George W. Bush administration, Julie McDonald and Craig Manson went through the rules and tried to fix them up as best they could within the legislative language. And Gail Norton or the White House, I don't know who, sat on those proposed changes for years, and then Dirk Kempthorne became Secretary of the Interior, and he threw them out the window and said, I'm not interested. So this is really our big chance, and if it actually does improve the working of the Endangered Species Act, then my view is maybe this would then give us a chance to come to Congress and say, you see, we can actually make this act work better for both wildlife and for the interests of people who are affected by habitat designations, and maybe that means that we could find some legislative changes to go even further and make the act work even better. So I think this is our big chance, and I really encourage you to get behind it with a lot of enthusiasm when this comes out in the next couple of weeks.
Wonderful. Well, don't go away.
Is that okay?
Everybody, if you agree with what I'm about to say, I want you to show the enthusiasm that you feel for the ideas that Myron's been telling, but don't applaud yet, because I want to say what you'll be applauding. If you share my view that we've learned fantastic amounts, including being enlightened with words that just express what we feel, for example, urban eco-imperialist. Boy, what a fabulous phrase. But he's also given us things that we can do, and he's given us inspiration, and he's let us know that we're not alone, that there are people in Washington really fighting for us. If you agree with all of that, on the count of three, make more noise than this hall has ever heard before, because that's how I feel. 1, 2, 3.
Thank you.
And one more thing, we do have a gift for you, but since you're going to get on a plane, I'll make sure it gets to you some other way than you carrying it. This is what you have.
Oh, wow. Thank you.
But I don't...
Did you grow all these things?
Yes.
Okay. Very good.
They're from all of our
Yes, very good. Thank you.
And I do have one more comment. Myron has some gifts for each of you, and I've been entrusted with them. I want to make sure that everybody gets one. If you don't get one because it's being passed out, find me, because I've got more. Thank you all very much. Myron from... take a picture of you with all the
Oh, wonderful.
What I'd like to do is call the other panelists up to the front of the room, please. And while they're coming, we'll take a quick picture. We're gonna be kind of pressed for time. So we've got some wonderful speakers here. I failed at the beginning to introduce you to the President's Council and the people who have served on planning this symposium for quite a few months. So I'd like to introduce to you, or at least acknowledge while they're getting ready for pictures, Sue McCrum, Doris Mold, Artis DeWall, and Mitzi Perdue and myself. We kind of worked together for several months to put this together. Doris was not able to be here. She's our immediate past president and should have been a moderator, but we're missing her and we're just wishing her well. So while the panel's coming up, we're going to just take a brief pause here.
Good morning, everyone. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce Brenda Berman. She is the Commissioner of Bureau of Reclamation, and on November 16, 2017, the United States Senate confirmed Brenda Berman as the 23rd Commissioner for the Bureau of Reclamation. She is the first woman sworn in to lead the reclamation. Berman has more than 25 years of experience working on Western issues, with an emphasis on water and natural resources. She previously served in the Department of the Interior as the Reclamation Deputy Commissioner and as Interior's Deputy Assistant Secretary for Water and Science. Her career spans experience in Congress as Legislative Counsel for Water and Energy for Senator Joe Kyle to state agencies, including the Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and the Salt River Project in Arizona. You're busy. She was a judicial clerk for the Supreme Court of the state of Wyoming and the Superior Court of Coconino County in Arizona, and worked as an attorney in private practice in Arizona. She began her career as a park ranger at the Grand Canyon National Park. Berman holds a Juris Doctor degree from the University of Arizona College of Law and a Bachelor of Arts degree from Kenyon College. She is licensed to practice law in Arizona, Colorado, and Wyoming. The Bureau of Reclamation is a contemporary water management agency and the largest wholesale provider of water in the country. In spring, it brings water to more than 31 million people and provides 1 out of 5 Western farmers with irrigation water for farmland that produces much of the nation's produce. Reclamation is also the second largest producer of hydroelectric power in the country. I'm excited to introduce Brenda, and Brenda, we're excited that you're in charge of our dams and water, so welcome.
Good morning. So just to get an understanding, the United States Bureau of Reclamation serves the 17 western states and sometimes Alaska, Hawaii, and the territories. Who here would consider themselves from the West? Ah, very good. We have a little bit of Minnesota. I saw there were a lot of folks from Minnesota. But just to give you an idea, so many of you are familiar with what we do. I wasn't sure if everyone was going to know exactly who we are. But first of all, thank you very much for having me here this morning. Thank you for coming to us on this rainy, cold June morning. We very much appreciate you being over here at the Department of the Interior. I am honored to be speaking to the nation's largest coalition of farm, ranch, and agribusiness women. I just learned about your existence last week, and so I apologize. We hadn't worked together before, but I hope this is just the beginning of a chance for us to all get to know each other and work more in the future. I know you've been together for more than 40 years. You've advocated for agriculture. You influence in Congress. You've empowered your members, and I just think it's so important to understand. In my introduction, I talked about 25 years of Western water and power experience. But I have to say that means that I've been going to Family Farm Alliance. I've been going to different water district meetings. I've been going to national water district meetings for a really long time now, it seems. And I have to say there are more and more women now. When I first showed up for those meetings, sometimes I'd be, one of 3 women working in a room of 50. And now I walk into these meetings, and in some places we're getting to at least half, which I think is fantastic. So I very much appreciate what you do to work for agriculture. Just a little background on reclamation. Reclamation provides approximately 140,000 Western farmers with irrigation water and 10 million farmland acres. That water helps produce 60% of the nation's vegetables and more than 1/4 of its fresh fruit and nut crops. Farmers and ranchers are the backbone of our nation's economy, which is why the President and Secretary Bernhardt are focused on streamlining regulations and restoring balance between how we protect the environment and how we grow our economy. Today, I'd just like to give a brief overview of Reclamation's mission, our current policy priorities, and some of the projects we're focused on. And then you'll hear a lot more from Andrea and Harriet as we move forward. So Reclamation was formed by Congress and President Theodore Roosevelt in 1902, and it was created to bring reliable water and power supplies to the West. It's a really very interesting history because it was ranchers and farmers from Nevada, from Arizona, from Colorado, from other states who took those long trains across the country. Arizona wasn't even a state yet, but they sent their people to Washington, D.C. to advocate because they knew that we were going to need some federal help to bring reliable supplies to the West. And Theodore Roosevelt supported creating the Bureau of Reclamation, then the Reclamation Service, and he told us to go forth. He told us to go forth and make the West give it as thriving an economy as we saw on the East Coast. And if you look across the West, that's our history. You look across the major cities, you look across so much of the agriculture that is across the West, and Reclamation, we are proud to be right there with you as the backbone, as the infrastructure, as Grand Coulee, as Hoover, as so many smaller projects across the West. And that's how we see our mission. Our mission is to deliver water and generate power in an environmentally and economically sound manner for the American people. And we take that very seriously. As said, we're the largest supplier and manager of water in the nation, and we are the second largest producer of hydropower. And we do that all on the 17 western states and a few more when we're working on it. We have more than 300 reservoirs with a total storage capacity of 140 million acre-feet. We manage water for agriculture, for municipal and industrial use, and we provide flood control and recreation for millions of people. We deliver 10 trillion gallons of water to more than 31 people each year. And as you know, working in water, we use gallons whenever we want to make it sound like a really big number. So not acre feet there, 10 trillion gallons. With respect to hydropower, we own 76 hydroelectric power plants, and we operate 53 of them. We also have a program that if an outside entity sees an opportunity to create hydropower on one of our systems, they can come in and use their own capital to put in and create hydropower on the reclamation system. So we generate about 40 billion kilowatt hours of electricity. That's enough for about 3.8 million homes every year. We also bring in about $1 billion of revenue that goes to the Treasury each year. Before I talk about some of our priorities across the West, I thought I'd first touch on the impact of women at reclamation. As said, I'm proud to be the Bureau of Reclamation's 23rd commissioner and the first woman sworn in to lead the organization. It only took us 115 years, so not bad. I know some other organizations are still waiting. But women are an integral part of reclamation and its mission. It'd be interesting to hear from some of you after the panel if, who you interact with at reclamation in your area offices and your regional offices. But of those 700 women who work at reclamation, we have about 250 are in leadership positions. They are leading teams. They are making decisions that are going to affect your water and so many others' water and power for years to come. About 20% of our engineers, including electrical, mechanical, and civil engineers, are women. That's almost double the national average for women in these positions. So we're very proud of that. In particular, I don't know if any of you have worked with her, but just recently I had the chance to hire Karen Knight, and she's a longtime reclamation employee, but she became the first woman to lead our safety, security, and law enforcement program. So it's up to us, right? We're making changes. And Karen has been chief of engineers. She's run our dam safety program. She has an incredible amount of background experience. But she's been in that position a year, and we're very proud to be moving forward. A few policy priorities. While our mission has remained largely unchanged for the last 30 years, the way we go about accomplishing that mission has changed dramatically. Early on, this administration made energy security and infrastructure a priority, especially out west. A significant portion of our funding is now dedicated to modernizing our water infrastructure. Remember, many of our projects are over 100 years old. Most are over 60. We are looking and concentrating and prioritizing increasing supply, making water more reliable, and alleviating the impacts of those current and future droughts. We've had a specific emphasis on Colorado River and California water issues, but we've been focused across the West. Fortunately, and I think when I look back in history, this is the first time in my lifetime, but when I look back, it's the first time since President Kennedy, we have a president that is prioritizing Western water. So we had a memo from the president last October, and he said we are going to make Western water more reliable. We are going to get water to farms and families, and we are going to make sure that that happens. Both from our perspective, how can you ask for better backing than that? The president wants us to succeed. He wants you to succeed. So we are here from Reclamation's point of view. That's happened now in a couple different places. So the memo lays out a number of items, and it's really across the board. It's some specific things where we've reinitiated consultation. In California, we're looking at new biological opinions on the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers. And that is an intense thing to address, but those biological opinions are over 10 years old right now, and we have learned so much since 2008 and 2009. So the idea is use those hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent on science, on inquiry, on analytics, on understanding the system better, and put it into some new biological opinions that will give us more flexibility in the system. So the reclamation team in California along with the Fish and Wildlife Service team in California and the NIMS team in California, have been working furiously, and the goal is to get that done in very early July, with the idea being that by the time we do our NEPA, we should have more flexibility in the system in time for the new water year next year. So that is absolutely a top priority of this administration, and we are getting it done. The memo addressed sort of everything across the board, like how can we make water more reliable? So I wish we had someone from USGS here to talk, because on the USGS side, it's about using our enhanced technology. Again, we have a system out there that was put in place a long time ago. Can we understand better when water is coming down the pipe? Can we use forecasting better so we know we can keep water in our reservoirs instead of releasing it in case we're going to have flood problems? These are all things we're working on across the board. Right now in Folsom Dam and Reservoir, we've completed a new forecasting process. So the idea being that we can change the rule curves. And if you're not familiar, rule curves are what put in by the Army Corps of Engineers in our reservoirs to say, when do you have to release water? So an example would be, we had a wet winter in California, and Folsom Dam in the past would have had to release so much water because of its capacity, not knowing what storms could bring into the future. And while we still are releasing in some of our flood control ops, both at Folsom and New Melones right now, we've completed with the Army Corps of Engineers a way to be smarter, to be able to look at the forecast 2 weeks ahead. We've put in infrastructure replacements. So we have a bigger spillway now, so we have more of an emergency backup system. And being able to look at that across our system and at our different dams and reservoirs, I think is going to give us that extra bit amount of flexibility that you need. Because when we can hold water in a wet year like this, then hopefully we can bring it forward and save it for a dry year, like maybe next year. Just as an example, don't know if any of you are in California, but 2017, wettest year on record. But we didn't have enough storage to hold it to the system, and we had a lot of regulations that forced us to release a lot of that water. So we are looking at major storage projects in the system. And we're not the first. Many of those storage projects, the planning and study for those were authorized back in the early 2000s. But we're going to get them done because if we had more storage in that system, in 2017, like I said, wettest year on record. 2018, it comes time for me to allocate water to Central Valley Project farmers. And I can tell some of them they're going to get water, but I can't tell all of them. There's a big group of farmers I can't tell if they're going to get any water. And that's shame on us, because you shouldn't, the whole idea of storage and water and bringing reliable supplies in drought is that you can save in those really big wet years and you can deliver in those really, really dry years. So we are looking at storage across the system in California. But number one, we've been looking at Shasta. So Shasta Reservoir sits at the top of the Sacramento River system. We have studied it. It looks like the smartest, most cost-effective project we could do in California. Both a mere 18.5-foot raise on Shasta Reservoir could mean over 600,000 acre-feet of new water for the system. It wouldn't happen every year. We know those wet years. We need to take advantage when they come. But when it could, in a year like 2018, which wasn't as wet as 2017, we would have been able to deliver water to our farmers and reliably. So storage, I think, is going to be a big part of how do we address drought, how do we address all the different factors in the system. More storage gives you more flexibility. Thanks. So that's one of the main focus we're looking at. We're also looking at storage. You know, if you're in California, you know these: Sites Reservoir, Los Vaqueros, New Melones, Temperance Flat Dam, the San Luis Reservoir, which is a holding reservoir south of the Delta. We are looking at dam safety upgrades for that reservoir, but also that is a relatively inexpensive project where we could add about 300,000 acre-feet with a simple raise to San Luis Reservoir. We are working with local entities to see if that's something that folks find to be worth the cost and worth the benefit, but that's something that could be moving to construction probably by 2021 if it moves forward. So we're very excited about that. A few other ways we're trying to make water more reliable, and I don't need to tell you that the best place to manage projects and infrastructure is as locally as possible. For a long time, we've worked with ranchers and projects and districts to transfer title of the projects. So the way the reclamation is set up is, at least for our first 50 years, the federal government would invest in these systems, dams, canals, reservoirs, pump stations, and over time, the beneficiaries would pay back the cost of that infrastructure. So most districts have paid back their projects, but the federal government still owns them. And sometimes that's voluntary. That sometimes the district has said, we want the federal government to own it. There are benefits to that. But in places where our districts are saying, we would like to own our project, it's been actually a pretty arduous process. We work with projects. We go through the NEPA compliance, all the different types of compliance you have to go through, and then you would have to go to Congress. In Congress, sometimes things run very smoothly, sometimes it can be unpredictable, and it was costing folks a lot of money to try and transfer these projects. So working with Congress for several years, they just passed and the President signed title transfer legislation a couple months ago. And what that does is it sets up an administrative program, so you don't have to go to Congress. We've got a categorical exclusion from CEQ, which should help streamline the ability to work through compliance. But the idea is if you have a simple project, if it's just an agricultural project, if there's not a lot of controversy surrounding it, then why are we holding things up? So we are moving forward immediately with the temporary rules for how this could happen. We're hoping some districts will go through the process this year, but we're very excited that this is going to be moving forward. And for those districts who choose, they can get management directly and locally. Let's see, Colorado River. Colorado River, I don't know if you saw in the papers, but about 2 weeks ago, we just completed with the 7 basin states and with the country of Mexico agreements to address severe drought on the Colorado River. So the Colorado River has been in drought for 19 plus years. It is the most severe drought in the history of our record keeping, which goes back about 110 years. And it's the most severe drought, or one of the most severe droughts we've seen in the paleo record, which is about 1,200 years. It is a serious situation on the river, and the reason that we are still delivering water today and have never had to declare a shortage in the lower basin to date is because we have massive storage on the system. We have about 50 million acre-feet just between Lake Powell and Lake Mead. There's about 10 million more in the upper basin through Colorado and Utah and Wyoming. And that has allowed us in the lower basin to never have declared a shortage. But we looked out on the horizon and we said, if this continues, we might lose the system. And losing the system in the lower basin would mean not being able to deliver water not only to major metropolitan areas, but to some of the largest agricultural districts in the United States. So the parties came together, we worked it out over several years, and we worked with Mexico, and there are agreements now to put contributions in the river, in the lake, if the lake levels start to get too low. And we expect that will start this year. We'll make a determination in August about what tier we're in and how that's going to move forward, but the states of Arizona and Nevada and the country of Mexico will be leaving extra water or contributing extra water to the system in 2020. That wasn't easy to bring together 7 states and major water districts in 2 countries, but we did it, and we did it because you need a reliable water supply, and it needs to be those on the ground who are determining how that happens and how that can work for them in their home state and their home districts. So we're proud to be moving forward. We've got a couple other projects we've been working on. Clay Elm Dam in Washington State. We're looking at increasing the storage capacity of that reservoir. When you talk about 50 million acre feet, and then you talk about clay element, it's 14,000 acre feet, a little bit more. But that extra flexibility on that system is going to mean that junior water users are more reliable. So we're not just focusing on those great big shiny projects. We are focusing on where can we make water reliable across the system. Those are a few projects we're working on. We're also working on some study projects in Idaho. But if you're working with us out on the land, then you know that we are across the 17 western states, and it's our job to help make your water more reliable. So I hope we are doing that. I hope you've seen the focus of this administration in trying to do that across all levels. I very much appreciate you having me here today, having us as a panel. It's been great to speak to you. I'll be happy to answer questions later, but proud to be working in Western water, proud to be working with Western agriculture, and we are using our time here to make sure that we leave it better than we found it. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, we just appreciate that information, and we probably have lots of questions for you later, so write them down, ladies. Our next speaker is, excuse me, I just turned the page, Dr. Andrea Travnicek from, she's Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. She provides oversight for the National Park Service. Interesting, all of the things that Mr. Ebell mentioned to us. It looks like we can have a great, candid conversation about all of the agencies and how we can work together with landowners in rural America, isn't it? So we're glad that you're in charge of that because we can talk to you directly now. Okay. In the previous roles as Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary, Water and Science, she provided oversight for the U.S. Geological Survey and the Bureau of Reclamation. Prior to joining Interior, she was appointed Senior Policy Advisor of Natural Resources by Governor Hoeven and Governor Dalrymple in North Dakota in July of 2010 to December 16, where she was responsible for assessing issues throughout the state and providing the direction for decision makers related to project development, legislation, and regulations at the state and national level. Additionally, she has international experience working on trade relating to discussions from January 2017 to June in 2017. She worked for the law firm Lockridge, Grindon, Nowen in Bismarck on issues related to energy. She holds a PhD in Natural Resources Management and Communication from North Dakota State University, where her research focused on social networks and stakeholders associated with lake management in Minnesota. She was selected as one of North Dakota's Business Watch 40 Under 40 in 2011. She was profiled in the July 2016 Bison Illustrated magazine and received the Distinguished Alumni Award from North Dakota State University's College of Agriculture, Food Systems, and Natural Resources in 2016. She was also nominated and selected as a delegate to American Council of Young Political Leaders to attend an international exchange to the country of Turkey in 2015. She is co-author of NDSU extension publication titled Identification and Control of Invasive and Troublesome Weeds in North Dakota, and in the federal government maybe, I don't know. Let's welcome Dr. Travnicek. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Well, good morning, everybody. I know it's quite the titles that I have had while I've been here at Department of Interior. Just a little bit of background about me. I just thought I'd give a little bit about that of how I ended up here working for President Trump and now for Secretary Bernhardt. I know with that kind of lengthy bio it gets a little bit confusing, but most recently, coming from North Dakota, I worked for the last two governors, and of course working on everything related to from water to agriculture. The reason I got excited about coming out here to work for President Trump and the Secretary was while I was in office working for Governor Dalrymple, of course we had a lot of the Waters of the U.S., the Clean Power Plan, a lot of these big regulatory overreach initiatives that were out there, and I felt like we weren't being heard a lot from our state perspective, and hearing from a lot of our different stakeholders and landowners that were within the state coming to us with concerns. So then being able to come out here, trying to make sure that while we all sit in these roles, that we are more responsive and that you have access to us each and every day. So I want to make sure that, yeah, you know who we are. It was great to hear from the commissioner. Started out my role working with the Water and Science, so have been able to work with her. And then my last role have been working a lot with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Park Service. And then actually as of 2 weeks ago, now I'm working with the land and minerals issues here at Department of Interior. So been able to wear a lot of different hats. So I was trying to figure out kind of some of the big topics that you might be interested in that I've been able to see over the last 2 years of being here. I know that Susan Combs, she gave a great welcome this morning, and she had touched on the reorganization that we're doing here at Department of Interior. What was pretty interesting is coming in, recognizing that all these different bureaus that we have a big agency that does manage the land for 20% of the country. So 1 in every 5 acres of the public land is managed by the Department of Interior. So having all these different bureaus that had 49 different regions can kind of become confusing as people are trying to figure out who they need to talk to if they do have questions or concerns. So it's been a very important initiative for us to try to unify all these different regions. So we are looking at 12 different unified regions where you'll be able to figure out who your person is that's from the Bureau of Reclamation, from the USGS, from the Bureau of Land Management, from the Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, knowing that they're all going to be talking to each other. We're going to have these these regional facilitators that as there are projects that are being proposed or worked on, with all these different NEPA documents, that you are able to find that key person that then is talking to everybody else that's associated with those bureaus. I know that when I was in the governor's office, we'd be very frustrated where you might be working with the Bureau of Reclamation or Bureau of Land Management, but might not be talking to somebody else that's at Department of Interior, so your projects get further and further behind. So this is something you continue to watch. It was implemented last fall. And we continue to work through that, doing the shared services of coordinated conservation, permitting, looking at recreation opportunities, and then, of course, our shared services from the HR perspective, looking at the IT, procurements, that type of thing. So that was just kind of a big overarching that we've been working on the last couple of years, and you'll continue to see more information on that. A big piece that I know that was brought up too was regulatory reform. With everything that has been going on, we want to make sure that we're getting these projects out quicker. So a lot of the streamlining, the permitting process that you might be coming forward with, or some of the NEPA documents too that we're trying to get these big projects completed. We had President Trump put out a executive order, and then a secretarial order had come out here from the secretary where we're trying to get these projects, a lot of these NEPA documents, they can get up to 10,000 pages. And it has quite the process to get all the way from the field to the region to headquarters to finally the signature here in D.C. So we're trying to figure out ways to get those streamlined with environmental assessments, try to get those pages down to 50 pages, get completed within 5 to 6 months, and then also from the EIS perspective, try to keep them under 150 to 300 pages and get them down, hopefully completed within a year. So those are big picture opportunities that we're trying to see if we can streamline, find better efficiencies, because I actually had worked for the Army Corps of Engineers in Sacramento and had to work on a lot of those NEPA documents. So know firsthand the amount of the research and expertise that's going in them, but we need to be able to get projects completed. So I wanted to touch on that. States authority, I was reading through a lot of your white papers and recognizing the role that the states have in managing fish and wildlife species and the public lands and waters. So there was a memo that came out from the secretary, the deputy secretary last fall, that was sent to the governors looking for opportunities on how we can better coordinate with the authorities that are associated with the state. So we directed the bureaus to review all the regulations and policies and guidance that pertains to conservation and management of that might be more restrictive than what the states have in place already. So you'll continue to see more of those rollouts from the bureaus, trying to make sure that we are doing some better coordination at the state level and then also the landowner level. I know that Myron, he touched with the Endangered Species Act. We were hoping to have Karen Budd-Fallon here today to give a little bit of an overview, and since I was just working with the Fish and Wildlife Service, I'd give you an update where we are in an interesting time, where we did dust off the ESA, some of the stuff that had been worked on previously, and we've made it one of our big priorities to figure out some of the sections that we could dive into and hopefully get a little bit more certainty, clarity of what those regulations are that are in place, because we know that every time, whether it's getting a species on the list or trying to get a species off the list, also trying to make sure that we're recovering the species. So there was a proposed rule that came out last fall, and it was looking at the Section 7 consultation process. Within that, we were proposing to revise some of the definitions related to effects of the action, adverse modification, environmental baseline, also looking to improve the consultation process, address certainty, and also recognize, have certainty in the mitigation that is proposed with some of those species. Also, Section 4 was another section that we had a proposed rule come out on, and that's where we wanted to ensure a consistent approach for the interpreting the foreseeable future. Clarify factors for delisting. The Endangered Species Act was not put in place to keep species on a list forever, so how do we try to get some of those species off once they are recovered? Redefine considerations for making a determination on critical habitat designations, and address concerns regarding designation of unoccupied critical habitat versus occupied habitat. So watch for that coming out here hopefully in the next 2-3 weeks, maybe a month, where we are trying to get those rules finalized. We had been seeing too that there was a lot of trying to define what habitat is. So all of a sudden, as these endangered species are becoming on the list, they have so much habitat that is set aside. Some of it's occupied, but then we really do need to define what unoccupied habitat is so we don't have that overreach and that landowners and industry has certainty. And then finally, the Section 4D rule is another one with the, where we're going to remove the blanket rule, where we're recognizing the difference between endangered and threatened species and become more in line with NIMPs. So we're not doing something completely different over here at Interior than what Commerce is doing. So trying to make sure that that marries up a little bit better. And also making sure that our regulations are appropriate for species on a case-by-case basis, so you don't have that blanket overview. And then also reading some of your white papers here, wanted to touch on the active land management. Of course, we've seen over the last few years the increase in the wildfires. I was actually one of the ones that was first on site with Secretary Zinke at the Paradise Fire. Coming from North Dakota, in the governor's office, I had worked a lot more with flooding. So getting out on site and seeing the devastation that comes with that active, with the wildfires that have taken place. This department and Secretary Bernhardt and also the President have put out, there's been an executive order and then a secretarial order put in place to recognize more active forest management. So with all of our land management plans, we are working to include fire management best practices so that we can facilitate better wildlife prevention, suppression and recovery planning measures. We're also looking to do better coordination and collaboration with land managing partners and other stakeholders. And of course, putting into place all these different types of active land management techniques, whether that's the prescribed burns, the mowing, the manual cutting, invasive species management, and issuing grazing permits more on a targeted basis. And of course, within that, fire management includes grazing, so we are also tying that into our active land management. We are looking to enhance the responsible use of the nation's rangeland as a forefront of the department's active management mission, bringing a lot of that back to the forefront also. We know that has kind of been pushed aside, and we want to recognize grazing and all that everybody is doing across the country into that. BLM right now administers nearly 18,000 grazing permits across 155 million acres of grazing land. So we're working to implement. I know it's been kind of a pilot project that we've been working on here the last year, but it's an outcome-based grazing authorization initiative. We're looking to improve BLM's management of grazing on public lands by offering livestock operators greater flexibility to more readily respond to changing on-the-ground conditions such as drought or wildfire. So basically making sure that we are working much more closely with those operators, with those livestock owners, as they are working with us to manage those public lands. So there will be more coming out in regards to that too, hopefully, very possible some rulemaking, so stay tuned on that. And I know that it was brought up that I was a co-author on an invasive species, so I know that that's been across all of our bureaus as well. So not only from Bureau of Reclamation, from Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, Bureau of Land Management, all these different bureaus are putting in more funding towards the invasive species, knowing that we need to work really closely with the landowners, the state, and all those different federal bureaus to make sure that we are continuing to try to control those species and decrease their invasiveness. And I know that when I came in, we had talked a little bit about broadband. I know that that is another priority that was from within your white paper. So the president did put out an executive order too, recognizing the rural communities and making sure that we get more access to broadband. Right now, a stat that I had seen was nearly 23 million Americans in rural parts of the country currently lack access to broadband. So President Trump recognized the value of high-speed broadband. It's becoming essential to connect rural America with information and population centers around the world, which of course will assist with more access to information on healthcare, education, connect consumers with businesses, so that everybody can be connected from anywhere in the United States. So what we're doing here at Department of Interior is we are working to develop a plan to allow private high-speed broadband companies to locate their equipment on interior infrastructure. We also recognize that of the 83% of the land in some of the western United States is owned by Interior, and that's where we're trying to make sure that we can get more accessibility of that broadband coming through those lands, looking at right-of-ways, so that there is that accessibility. So you'll be seeing more coming out from this administration in regards to that too, hopefully in the next 6 months to a year. So those are some of the kind of just the big picture that was broad across all the different bureaus that I've worked with so far. I know you mentioned the National Park Service too. Since I've worked on that, I'll touch on just a few things. Trying to make sure that we are a better neighbor. I know that Myron, he had mentioned stay away from the Park Service, but I think that's the worst you can do. I think you've got to make sure that you are there trying to work with them, trying to express your concerns with them. So hopefully that there is some more of that better neighbor from the Park Service. So, because we are trying to make sure that the public has better access, better neighbor. While I was sitting in the role, we were also working on issues even in Point Reyes in California, recognizing the grazer, grazing that takes place out there. So we really want to be cognizant of a lot of those in-holders that are within the National Park Service, land managers, and the neighbors that surround those. And then same thing with Fish and Wildlife Services, with the refuges. I know it was discussed that you've got those boundaries of the refuges. We want to make sure that all of you have access to there as well. So I'd say continue. The big thing about this administration and what we're doing, I know I kind of went through a laundry list there, but just know that we are accessible. We're trying to make sure that we are being responsive to the concerns that all of you have. And that's why I think we wanted to make a point to be here today and make sure that you can get to us. When I was in the governor's office, we couldn't always get our concerns heard. Might not always be the right answer that we're looking for, but at least we're here. Hopefully we can find a right decision that benefits you, all of you. And it's just been amazing to be here with you this morning. Coming from, I grew up as a military brat, moved every 3 years, so I've lived in California, lived in Nebraska, lived in Texas, lived in North Dakota. Both my parents are from northern Minnesota. And then going to an ag college at NDSU, some of my best friends, some of the women that I went to college with are now, they're the heads of their family farms. There wasn't any sons to pass it over to, so I get all the stories, the phone calls. Andrea, what about this? What about this? And coming from North Dakota, understand your concerns in regards to some of those conservation, wetland easements as well. So just know that you've got the experts that are here. We're here to listen. We're here to work for you. Super excited and proud of all of you for coming here and pushing all of your initiatives, getting out and meeting with your delegation. Come come pushing all your issues to us too. So I'm going to hang around for a little bit, make sure that we can continue discussions. I know that I even had an opportunity to talk about Florida and the Everglades this morning already, where I was chairing a task force there 3 weeks ago that had everybody from stakeholders to fisheries to tribal perspectives to agricultural perspectives. And that's why I went for my PhD in social networks and stakeholder analysis, because it really is making sure that we're hearing all the different perspectives. And coming from most recently an ag state, just appreciate everything that you do. So thank you for having me here today. Look forward to your questions and looking forward to visiting with you.
Thank you, Andrea. Thank you for the invitation to stay in touch, too. You probably gave that to a very active group of women who will be in touch. So thank you. Our next speaker is no stranger to American Agr-Women. She was at our symposium in 2015. She's done a lot of work on federal regulations, and we're so excited that Harriet is able to be here and share her information, maybe summarize some of the notes that we've had here today. But she grew up in a ranch in Fort Laramie, Wyoming. She graduated from the University of Wyoming College in Law in 1989 and is currently licensed to practice law in the states of Wyoming, Nebraska, and Colorado. She's built a successful business practice representing irrigation districts, ranchers, farmers, industry groups, other businesses, and a variety of governmental entities. She's on the Board of Litigation for the Mountain States Legal Foundation and is a member of the Steering Committee for the Wyoming Business Alliance. She works with the local natural resource districts to deal with the impacts of the Endangered Species Act and the Republican River Compact. Some of her key challenges in Wyoming have been the Fish and Wildlife's management and recovery of the Canadian gray wolf and other species, the protection of private property from contaminated discharges, predator control, protection of grazing rights on BLM and private lands, and protection of water rights. Focusing her practice for the last 20 years on water and natural resource issues, she has turned her attention to federal regulatory reform and recently took a position as Senior Litigation Counsel for the New Civil Liberties Alliance. She was inducted into the Wyoming Agricultural Hall of Fame. Whether the issue be wolves, roads, federal land management, or water rights, she is there fighting for the rights of the agriculture community, said the Wyoming State Engineer, Pat Tyrrell. Her focused energy comes from her very real love of agriculture, having grown up in the business, and her fervent desire to protect a way of life that at times seems attacked from every corner. She has been a symposium previous panelist and is no stranger to American Agr-Women. Her perspectives of a private practitioner she will present to you. Please welcome Harriet Hageman.
Thank you, Karen. It is wonderful to be back in front of you. I was here in 2015, and then I had an opportunity to go up to Montana and spend some time with Karen as well in talking about some of the issues that are very near and dear to my heart. I did grow up on a ranch near Fort Laramie, Wyoming. I've been a practicing attorney for 30 years, and over the last 6 weeks, I've had a pretty fundamental shift in what I have been doing. I've had my own private law firm in Wyoming focusing on water and natural resources, and I recently took a position with the New Civil Liberties Alliance here in Washington, D.C. I'm actually going to be spending the majority of my time in Wyoming, but commuting back and forth. And as you can imagine, there's quite a juxtaposition between hanging out in a city like D.C. and going back to Fort Laramie, Wyoming, population 300 people. It is your theme today is the good and the bad and the ugly, and I am very thankful for being here, and I'm very thankful for the comments from the two women who spoke before me. I appreciate the work that you've done. I appreciate your dedication to the United States, and I appreciate your dedication to addressing some of the fundamental issues that are so incredibly important to the ag industry. I like hearing about reform. I like hearing about new ideas. I like hearing from people who are working in the bureaucracy here in Washington, D.C., who recognize that there are real people out in the world who are being impacted by the decisions that are made. I want to first talk about the good, because that is part of the theme, as I just said. I have worked with the United States Bureau of Reclamation for many, many years, primarily in the Wyoming office. I have represented quite a few different irrigation districts that receive their water through Bureau projects, whether it's Casper-Alcova Irrigation District, Shoshone Irrigation District, Goshen Irrigation District, legal water users, and quite a few others. So I am very familiar with your operations and have enjoyed the folks that I've had the opportunity to work with at the Bureau. One of the things that I like to talk about in working with Shoshone Irrigation District is something that I discovered many years ago. I was up at Shoshone, which is in the northwestern part of Wyoming, and the Buffalo Bill project was the very first project actually constructed under the 1902 Reclamation Act. I would encourage any of you to go visit Cody and to go see that reservoir. It's absolutely a beautiful site. But my mother used to travel with me pretty extensively, and while I was meeting with Shoshone Irrigation District, she was going through the photo albums in the archives for Shoshone, and she found that they had put together a photo album for every single year of that project, starting when they first started constructing it in the early 1900s. And she talked about how difficult it must have been to build that reservoir and dam. And she talked about how tattered the men looked, and their clothes were just in rags. And they literally laid on their backs and they constructed that dam and reservoir with picks and axes. Those men lived in man camps, and the United States Bureau of Reclamation actually had to put armed guards around the man camps because the men kept trying to escape. And you think about what they did to create that project, and what you realize is that those men and the folks in the Bureau at that time were not really constructing that reservoir for them. They were constructing that reservoir for us. And it has been in the last 120 years that we've been able to reap the benefits associated with the work that they did. The U.S. Bureau of Reclamation continues to do a phenomenal job in terms of managing their resources and making sure that those of us in the arid West have water for our crops and our livestock. As far as the National Park Service and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, I do believe that they were created with laudable goals. We love going to places like Yellowstone National Park and the Grand Teton National Park and places like that. We also recognize that we're richer for preserving certain species, whether they be the whooping crane or the piping plover or some of those. At the same time, I think that we also have to look at the real implication of what has happened over the last 30 to 40 to 50 years in terms of not just these agencies so much, but the federal overreach and the federal impact on all of our lives in general. Right now, I'm going to talk about the bad. Again, we've talked a little bit about the good. Let's talk about what the bad situation is. Our federal government, as of today, I just checked it a few moments ago, is $22.325 trillion in debt. That is $68,000 for every citizen. It is $182,000 for every single taxpayer in the United States. The regulatory burden, the federal regulatory burden in this country is right at $2 trillion a year. It affects every one of us. It costs every single one of us approximately $14,000. It is the second highest expense that we pay. The only higher expenses are housing. It is a hidden tax that most of us don't even recognize we are paying. The United States Forest Service has a road maintenance backlog of over $11 billion, and the Park Service is similar. All of our federal agencies have shortfalls, and the problem is that there are real and immediate and sometimes catastrophic consequences associated with that situation. I'm going to just talk about one because I was visiting with a woman as I was walking in here today talking about the impacts of flooding throughout the Midwest of the United States and the West as well. The Corps of Engineers was created primarily as an organization that addressed flood control. But over the last 10 to 15 years, 20 years, their mission statement has moved away from flood control and looked at recreating what they refer to as the natural conditions. What we know is that when that is the kind of changes that are made and decisions that are made out of Washington, D.C., again, there are real consequences to those of us who live in the interior part of the country. And what we're seeing now, and what you see on the Missouri River, and you see on the Mississippi River, and you see on the Platte River, and you see in these various systems, is you see that those changes, those philosophical changes, affect real people. And from my standpoint, those are the people that are the backbone of this country, our ag industry, our producers of our food and fiber, the people who protect our land, the people that manage our resources. And so what happens when you have a Corps of Engineers that makes the decision that they're going to keep the reservoirs high and that they're going to take out levees or they're going to make changes like that that will actually cause the catastrophic flooding that we see, we need to recognize that there need to be some real fundamental changes in the dialogue and the decisions that are made in Washington, D.C. In 2017, a court held that the changes from the Corps of Engineers and their changes in their mission was the proximate cause of some of the devastating flooding that we saw in the Midwest. We see the photographs, we see the videos, and we know what happens. We know what happens when you can't get your corn in, when you can't get your soybeans in, when you're incapable of protecting your livestock. And this year has been an especially devastating year. Just looking at Wyoming alone, the federal government owns approximately 30 million acres of land within the state of Wyoming. 30 million acres. It is 48.2% of our surface estates. The federal government owns approximately 640 million acres throughout the United States. But when you think about it from the standpoint of percentages, east of the Rocky Mountain West, the federal government owns on average less than 10% of each state, and most are under 5%. But the federal government owns an average of about 50% in the Rocky Mountain states. And again, being a rancher coming from a ranch and working for municipalities, irrigation districts, livestock producers, farmers, trade groups, I can tell you that there are very important differences between the eastern United States and western United States in terms of our ability to control our own destiny, in terms of our ability to preserve our prosperity, in terms of our ability to make sure that young people like we see here today are able to stay on those farms and ranches into the long distant future. The decisions made by the federal managers in Washington, D.C. have caused, among other things, the incidence of ever-increasing catastrophic forest fires. The pine beetle outbreak that we have experienced in the state of Wyoming, I don't know, and throughout the interior West. I don't know if many of you have been over to Yellowstone recently or driven over Togety Pass, but as you go through the National Forest Service lands, what you see are toothpicks. There are no trees left. And that is in large part because of the pine beetle outbreak. We have seen the destruction of our national grasslands in the state of Wyoming. It's been terribly devastating. We've seen the closure of roads and trails, and providing access to these lands has been reduced. We've seen a reduced financial return to the American public. And one of the things that I very much appreciate listening to both of you say today is you have talked about the President's commitment to change these policies, and the President's understanding and recognition of what the previous administration did to those of us who live out, and I guess what I would say in some ways is real-world America. I appreciate the priorities that I know President Trump has put on changing these issues and the priorities of putting folks like you in place so that we can start having that dialogue and really start fundamentally changing where we're going in this country. I truly believe that one of the most important things that we need to do as states is we need to start being a lot more effective and a lot more aggressive about demanding things out of Washington, D.C. to change what is happening. We need to start looking at different pilot projects that are not looking at nibbling around the edges or a few things that we might be able to change temporarily and short term. Because the fact is, right now, we have an administration in place that wants to change things and understands the significance of these issues. But I don't know who's coming after him, and neither do you. We have to make sure that we are doing things today that will have long-term impacts in terms of federal land management. We need to make sure that the decisions that are being made today, the good decisions coming out of your office, are permanent, not temporary. And it is for that reason one of the things that my organization, the New Civil Liberties Alliance, has done is that we have requested rulemakings from every single one of your agencies, from all of these agencies, to fundamentally change how rules are implemented, how guidance and how guidelines and policies are adopted. Because what we found with this last administration, I can tell you it has been and it was devastating to so many of the people that I work with. And I want to make sure that we don't ever have to suffer through some of those things again. What has happened with the Corps of Engineers and what we are seeing with this flooding is specifically related to what happened before this administration went into effect. And we need to make sure that these kinds of things never are visited upon our farmers and ranchers again. So one of the things that I think is so incredibly important is that these agencies do go through the very difficult task right now of rulemaking to make it very difficult for these agencies in the future to use guidance or policy to change things such as the Corps of Engineer mission statement without ever having any changes in the implementing legislation at all. That is one of the things that I very much encourage our agencies to do to make sure that your footprint and your impact is permanent. And we can change things for the better for this country. But something else that I want to do when looking specifically at federal land management and just looking at the state of Wyoming, with 30 million acres, I truly believe that we ought to start doing pilot projects between the state and the states and the federal government. Whether it's in Colorado, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, Wyoming, Montana, North Dakota, any of those Rocky Mountain states that have such high percentages of federal land, I want to see pilot projects where 500,000 acres, 1 million acres, 1.2 million acres, 150,000 acres. I don't know what the magic number is, but we start working between the states and the federal government to do pilot projects whereby the states will take over management of these resources, generate and earn the revenue off of those resources while they are managing them for the next 20 to 25 years. And I know that we can demonstrate that under state management, many of these lands can be better managed, better for the citizens of those states and better for the country overall. I ran for governor of the state of Wyoming last year, and one of the things that I proposed was that we have a pilot project in the state of Wyoming where we just take 1/30 of the federal land holdings, 1 million acres. We identify 1 million acres in the state of Wyoming, take over management of those in order to demonstrate that we can do a better job of managing those. Because if there's one thing that I have learned in all of the years of doing what I have done, is that the closer you are to the resource, the more effective you are at managing it, taking care of it. It is just that simple. You cannot make effective decisions out of Washington, D.C. that are going to be good in every single place in the state of Wyoming and that are going to work in Montana, again, in North Dakota and South Dakota and Nebraska and Wyoming and Utah and Idaho. Every one of those states are different. And we need to acknowledge those differences, and we need to acknowledge it by recognizing that sometimes these states are the better ones to manage these resources, and that's something that I would like to work with this administration to start working on some of those kinds of pilot projects. One of the things that I think is very, very important, and again, in studying and doing the work that I've done over the years, is that I think that we see, and you heard Mr. Ebell talk a bit about this, you've seen just a real concerted effort and a real concerted attack on private property rights. It's something that I have seen with the work that I have done, whether it's through the auspices of the Endangered Species Act, whether it's through the effort to try to enforce or push conservation easements in areas where they're not appropriate, whether it is the federal government appropriating $900 million to go and buy more land. Who in this room could possibly think that that would be a good idea? 640 million acres, $22 trillion in debt. Does anybody truly believe that the federal government spending more money to buy up private property is a good use of those resources? That is absolute insanity, but I see it every single day, the attacks on private property rights, whether it's through the WOTUS rule, the Waters of the U.S. rule, again, the Endangered Species Act, the Corps of Engineers inundating private property. It goes on and on and on, and I truly believe that the attacks on our private property ownerships, the attacks on the effort to stockpile more and more and more power in Washington, D.C., and thereby preventing local communities from being in control of their own destinies. I just don't believe that any of this is going to end well. I don't think any of this can end well. Private property ownership is absolutely 100% the most important thing that we have in this country that protects our freedom, our liberty, and it ensures our prosperity. It is that simple. It is what differentiates us from every other country on earth. I'm just going to leave you with this. I truly, truly believe that if you cannot own property, you are property. We need to fundamentally change the state-federal relationship, and we need to fundamentally change the relationship between the citizens and the federal government. We can do that through organizations like you. We can do that working with the President administration. We can do that working with these fine women up here. We can do this if we are all dedicated to the same thing, which is the ideals of our Constitution, the ideals of recognizing who and what we are as a country. Again, I very much appreciate the opportunity to speak with you today. I'll be around for a while to answer any questions or answer questions up here. Thank you for what you do.
Wow. Thank you all speakers. We just appreciate it so much. We do have time for question and answers, so I'm excited about that. So again, just to remind you, as you stand up to give your question, please identify yourself and the state you are from or the organization you are from. State your question, and once you've had a chance, please leave the floor for someone else to answer or to ask questions. Thank you. Jeanette.
Yes. Are we on? Okay, yes, my name is Jeanette Lombardo, and I'm the national president. I'm from California. I live in Ventura, California. So you probably know what's coming. First of all, I would like to say to Brenda, thank you for your comments about women in agriculture, in water. I work in water and reclamation, and I thank you for your leadership and your efforts. I really do. We have issues with dams, even locally, small dams. I'm thinking United Water Conservation District, where we were forced to release water into a dry river, a river where the water goes underground and never makes it to the ocean. And the reason for this was to let salmon come back up. We had the Thomas Fire. We lost 750 homes about a year and a half ago. There was no water in the reservoir for helicopters to do their drops. There was, we watched irrigation piping just burn up and melt. We watched so many devastating things happen. And one of the reasons it happened is burn plans could not be implemented. And this was locally. And the reason is because people didn't want ash falling on their car. They wanted the cattlemen to provide them with a coupon to go have their cars washed. They were worried about air quality. And if that had not have happened, those houses would not have been lost. We would not have had the mudslides in Montecito and lost 20 people. And how do we stop? This is my question. How do we stop and overcome the lack of common sense that it clearly is not out there in these areas where there is urban interface?
Good question. No, I'm sorry your community had to go through that. It was truly... It was a horrifying event. I know the secretary went out to California to view the fires. I was up at the Carr Fire where we almost lost some of our structures up north. First thing I will say is thank you to the firefighting community, because I can't believe what they did just to protect reclamation's resources and to try and protect the local community. I think Andrea and I can comment here, but the secretary recognizes that what has happened in the past is not working as far as preventing catastrophic wildfire. He is trying to work across agencies, Department of Agriculture, but also with, EPA and others of how do we actually get thinning done? How do we get our forests restored to a more healthy condition, which would prevent those catastrophic wildfires. It would allow wildland fire where it's appropriate to run on the ground where it traditionally has, instead of getting up into the canopy and devastating huge swaths of Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, California, Oregon, etc. I don't know if you want to comment on anything particular.
Yeah, I think the big thing of being able to communicate and collaborate with all the different agencies and bureaus and at that state level and the landowners, just recognizing the importance of that forest management. And I know that you touched on a little bit of having the access to the water as well. So just trying to make sure everybody is educated on how that land management is conducted and what kind of changes that we can get into place by working together, and maybe putting some more of those resources on the ground and active management practices.
And I want just one quick side. I wanted to thank you for the coordination comments, because our Long Beach office hasn't issued a permit in over 2 decades, and that's one of the reasons we have the issue with the reservoir. But thank you.
I think one of the things you also need to do is start demanding that your states, your state leaders become a much more involved and aggressive about requiring the federal government to come in and manage these areas, or to do the pilot projects. Your state has been devastated by this, but there needs to be that state leadership as well.
Well, good morning. My name is Sarah Reed-Herman. I'm the current state president for California Women for Agriculture. And
Sarah, could I hold that for just 1 minute?
Yeah.
I'd like to just interrupt for a minute. We're going to close our webcast right now. We'll have a few minutes afterwards to finish that, so if you wouldn't mind holding that thought. We'd like to, first of all, thank all of our speakers, our panelists that were here today. You guys did an awesome job. We just appreciate all that you've done in the interior, and also, Harriet, for you coming out and presenting to us. I'd like to thank our sponsors who have stepped up to support our education program for American Agr-Women, the American Agr-Women Foundation, Ohio Agr-Women, Maine Agr-Women, Texas Agr-Women, Minnesota Agr-Women, Montana Agr-Women, Nutrilix, Superior Livestock, and Zern Farm. And a special thank you to the Department of Interior for letting us have this event here. So thank you very much. We're going to just take a minute, wrap it up, and we'll go back to questions. Okay? Okay, thank you very much. That was the good, bad, and ugly, you know. Okay, so thank you, Sarah, for waiting. Also, what I want to do one more time is thank all of the past presidents, in case we get in a rush here, for all of the support they've given here, and then we'll take a few more questions, and then we'll wrap it up so we can get to the USDA. Sarah, thank you.
I will just start over. My name is Sarah Reed-Herman. I'm the current state president for California Women for Agriculture. I also happen to sit on the board of directors for the Water Education Foundation and live in Folsom, California. So I feel like Commissioner Berman's comments kind of centered around my world a little bit right there. I have a